The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical scope one final time. His team of 6 Navy SEALs had been tracking a high-value target for 3 days through the treacherous mountain passes near the Pakistan border. Intelligence reports indicated that Abdul Rahman, a key Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces, was hiding in a small compound tucked into the valley below. Morrison had led dozens of missions like this one, but something felt different today. The usual chatter from local radio frequencies had gone silent 12 hours ago, and their Afghan interpreter, Hassan, seemed unusually nervous as they approached the target location. The team had been moving since before dawn, using the cover of darkness to position themselves on the ridgeline overlooking the suspected hideout. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the team's communications specialist, crouched beside a large boulder and whispered into her radio. "Base, this is Viper 6. We have eyes on the target compound. No visible movement, but thermal imaging shows at least 8 heat signatures inside the main building." Her voice was steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was her 15th deployment, and she had learned to trust her instincts when something didn't feel right. The compound consisted of 3 mud brick buildings connected by high walls, typical of rural Afghan architecture. What concerned Morrison was the lack of normal daily activity. No children playing in the courtyard, no women hanging laundry, no men tending to livestock. In a region where families lived together in multi-generational compounds, this silence was ominous. Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Chen, their explosives expert, had been studying the building layouts through his binoculars for the past hour. "Boss, those walls are thicker than usual, and I'm seeing what looks like reinforced positions at the corners. This isn't just a family home." His observation sent a chill down Morrison's spine. They might be walking into a trap. The plan was straightforward. Approach from the north under cover of the pre-dawn darkness, breach the main door, and secure Rahman before he could escape or destroy valuable intelligence. But as the team prepared to move, Hassan grabbed Morrison's arm with trembling hands. "Sir, please, we should wait." "Something is wrong here. The birds, they are too quiet, and I see no smoke from cooking fires." Morrison paused, weighing the interpreter's concerns against their mission timeline. Rahman was expected to move locations within the next 6 hours, and this might be their only chance to capture him alive. The intelligence he possessed could prevent dozens of future attacks and save countless lives. After a moment of internal debate, Morrison made the decision that would change everything. "We proceed as planned," he announced quietly to his team. "But stay sharp. Chen, I want you watching our 6. Santos, keep that radio hot. If this goes sideways, we'll need immediate extraction." The team acknowledged with silent nods and began their descent toward the compound. As they moved down the rocky slope, using sparse vegetation for cover, none of them noticed the glint of sunlight reflecting off a telescope lens positioned high in the mountains behind them. Someone had been watching them for hours, tracking their every movement with the patience of a seasoned hunter. The first sign of trouble came when they were still 200 meters from the compound walls. Chen, who had been monitoring their rear approach, suddenly raised his fist in the universal signal to halt. Through his scope, he had spotted muzzle flashes from positions they hadn't identified during their reconnaissance. "Contact rear!" he shouted, just as the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the valley. The team dove for cover behind a cluster of rocks as bullets began striking the ground around them with deadly accuracy. These weren't the wild, undisciplined shots typically associated with Taliban fighters. Someone with serious training was targeting them with precision fire from multiple concealed positions. Morrison quickly realized they had walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush. Santos frantically worked her radio, calling for air support while simultaneously trying to establish their exact position for extraction. "Mayday, mayday. Viper 6 is taking effective fire from multiple positions. We need immediate close air support and extraction." But the radio crackled with static, and she couldn't establish a clear connection with their base. The enemy had somehow managed to jam their communications. As bullets continued to rain down on their position, Morrison assessed their situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through countless firefights. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from support. The nearest friendly forces were at least 30 minutes away by helicopter, assuming their distress call had gotten through. Their ammunition was limited, and the enemy seemed to know exactly where they were positioned. Petty Officer First Class David Park, their medic, was treating a grazing wound on Chen's shoulder when he spotted movement on the ridgeline above them. "We've got shooters on the high ground about 400 meters northeast," he reported grimly. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly to create a crossfire that would eventually overwhelm the SEAL team's defensive position. What Morrison didn't know was that Rahman had been expecting them. An informant within the Afghan security forces had provided details about the mission, including their likely approach routes and timing. The compound had been evacuated days earlier, leaving only armed fighters waiting in carefully prepared positions. It was a trap designed to eliminate an entire SEAL team and deal a psychological blow to coalition forces. As the intensity of incoming fire increased, Morrison made rapid calculations about their chances of survival. They could hold their current position for maybe 20 minutes before their ammunition ran low. Moving to a different location would expose them to the crossfire, but staying put meant certain death when their bullets ran out. Neither option offered much hope. The mysterious observer in the mountains had been tracking this entire sequence through a high-powered scope, watching as events unfolded with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen similar scenarios play out many times before. This person had arrived in the area 3 days earlier, following intelligence reports about increased Taliban activity, but had no official connection to the SEAL mission. As bullets continued to fly and the situation grew increasingly desperate, none of the embattled SEALs could have imagined that their salvation would come from an unexpected source. Someone they had never met, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, was already calculating angles and wind speeds for shots that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. 800 meters away, Dr. Sarah Mitchell lowered her medical supply backpack and reached for the custom rifle case she had been carrying for the past week. As a volunteer doctor with Doctors Without Borders, she had been traveling through the region to establish a mobile clinic for remote villages when she heard the distinct sound of automatic weapons fire echoing through the valley below. Sarah had not always been a humanitarian doctor. Before dedicating her life to medicine, she had served 8 years as a Marine Corps scout sniper, with 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. Her military service record was exemplary, with over 40 confirmed kills and a reputation for impossible shots under extreme conditions. But after losing her younger brother in an IED explosion in Fallujah, she left the military to pursue medicine, determined to save lives rather than take them. Now 34 years old, Sarah had spent the last 6 years providing medical care in the world's most dangerous places. She spoke fluent Pashto and Dari, understood local customs, and had earned the trust of tribal leaders across the region. Her medical missions often took her into areas where conventional military forces feared to tread, but her combination of medical skills and tactical awareness kept her alive in places where others wouldn't survive. Through her powerful spotting scope, Sarah could see the trapped SEAL team pinned down behind inadequate cover. She recognized military tactics and equipment immediately, knowing these were American Special Forces caught in a carefully planned ambush. Her trained eye quickly identified at least 12 enemy positions spread across multiple elevations, all coordinated to create a deadly crossfire. Sarah's mind raced as she analyzed the tactical situation. The enemy fighters were positioned in a classic L-shaped ambush formation, with the primary killing zone focused on the SEALs' current position. Heavy machine gun fire was coming from a fortified position about 300 meters to the west, while precision rifle fire originated from elevated positions to the north and east. The enemy had planned this ambush perfectly, leaving the SEALs with no viable escape routes. She opened her rifle case with practiced efficiency, revealing a custom-built precision rifle that had been her constant companion during her humanitarian missions. The weapon was supposedly for protection against wild animals and bandits, but Sarah had maintained it to military standards, knowing that her medical work often took her into active conflict zones where such tools might mean the difference between life and death. The rifle was a modified M40A6, the same model she had used during her military service, but enhanced with a premium barrel, advanced optics, and custom ammunition she hand-loaded herself. Every component had been carefully selected and tested to ensure accuracy at extreme distances. Sarah knew this weapon's capabilities intimately, having practiced with it regularly at remote mountain ranges during her travels. As she assembled the rifle with swift, automatic movements learned through years of training. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had made her one of the Marine Corps' most effective snipers. Her pulse slowed, her breathing became controlled, and her mind entered the focused state that allowed her to make impossible shots under pressure. The years of humanitarian work hadn't dulled her military skills. Sarah's first priority was identifying the most dangerous threats to the trapped SEALs. Through her scope, she could see a heavy machine gun position that was pouring devastating fire into their location. The gunner was partially concealed behind sandbags, but Sarah had dealt with similar positions many times during her military service. She calculated the range at 650 meters, accounting for elevation, wind speed, and atmospheric conditions. The shot would be challenging, but not impossible. What concerned Sarah more was the aftermath. Once she started shooting, she would reveal her position to at least 20 armed fighters who would immediately begin hunting for her. She had no support, no extraction plan, and no backup weapons beyond her sidearm, and the limited ammunition she carried for hunting and protection. But watching the SEALs' desperate situation through her scope, Sarah knew she couldn't walk away. These men were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and she had the skills to help them. Her medical oath required her to save lives whenever possible, and her military training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. Sarah settled into a stable shooting position behind a large boulder, using her backpack to create a solid rest for her rifle. She controlled her breathing, let her heart beat slow, and began the careful process of lining up her first shot. The machine gunner was her primary target, as eliminating that position would give the SEALs their best chance of survival. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flashes from the heavy weapon and tracked back to identify the shooter's exact position. The man was experienced, firing in controlled bursts and repositioning between volleys to avoid return fire. But Sarah had been hunting men like this for years during her military service, and she understood how they thought and moved. The wind was tricky at this distance, with mountain thermals creating unpredictable air currents. Sarah observed the movement of dust and vegetation to gauge wind direction and strength, making minute adjustments to her scope settings. She had only one chance to make this shot count, as missing would alert every enemy fighter to her presence without helping the trapped Americans. As she prepared to fire, Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. She had left the military to escape violence and dedicate herself to healing, yet here she was again, preparing to take lives to save others. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had learned that sometimes the most humanitarian act required the most decisive violence. The crosshairs settled on her target as Sarah exhaled slowly and applied gentle pressure to the trigger. Years of training and muscle memory took over as the rifle fired with a controlled explosion that echoed across the mountain valley. Through her scope, she watched the machine gunner jerk backward and collapse, his weapon falling silent immediately. The effect on the battle below was dramatic and immediate. With the heavy machine gun eliminated, the SEALs had breathing room to return fire and reposition. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. She had revealed her presence, and now every enemy fighter in the valley would be searching for the ghost shooter who had just changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Sarah quickly chambered another round and began scanning for her next target. The enemy fighters were already showing confusion and panic as they tried to locate the source of the shot that had eliminated their primary weapon position. She had maybe 30 seconds before they organized a coordinated response to hunt for her position. Lieutenant Commander Morrison couldn't believe what he was witnessing. One moment his team was taking devastating fire from a heavy machine gun position, and the next moment the weapon had gone silent with the distinctive sound of a high-powered rifle shot echoing from somewhere in the mountains above. Someone with exceptional marksmanship skills was engaging the enemy from an elevated position, but Morrison had no idea who it could be. "Did you see that shot?" Sergeant Santos whispered in amazement, watching through her scope as confusion spread among the enemy fighters. "That machine gunner just dropped like a stone. Someone's up there with some serious skills." The relief in her voice was evident as the overwhelming volume of fire directed at their position suddenly decreased significantly. Sarah Mitchell was already acquiring her next target when she spotted movement from a sniper position about 400 meters to the northeast. The enemy marksman was trying to relocate after seeing his machine gunner eliminated, but his movement patterns were predictable to someone with Sarah's training. She tracked him through her scope as he moved from one concealed position to another. The enemy sniper was good, but he was operating according to standard guerrilla warfare tactics that Sarah had studied extensively during her military service. He moved in short rushes between cover, paused to scan for targets, then moved again. But he made the crucial mistake of following a pattern, and patterns could be predicted and exploited by someone with superior training and equipment. Sarah led her target slightly, accounting for his movement speed and direction, then squeezed the trigger with the same calm precision she had demonstrated thousands of times during her Marine Corps service. The bullet struck the enemy sniper center mass, dropping him immediately and eliminating another significant threat to the trapped SEAL team. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the entire battlefield layout in a way that wasn't possible for the SEALs pinned down in the valley. She had tactical awareness that came from years of studying terrain, understanding enemy movement patterns, and coordinating complex military operations. This perspective allowed her to identify threats and opportunities that the ground-based fighters couldn't. See, Morrison was beginning to understand that whoever was providing sniper support was exceptionally skilled and had positioned themselves perfectly to support his team. The shots were coming at precisely the right moments, eliminating the most dangerous threats with surgical precision. But he still had no idea who their mysterious benefactor might be. "Santos, can you raise anyone on the radio yet?" Morrison asked while scanning the ridgeline for muzzle flashes from their unknown ally. The communications jamming had been partially disrupted when the machine gun position was eliminated, suggesting the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities were more limited than initially thought. "Still getting heavy static, but I think I'm picking up some chatter from base," Santos replied, adjusting her radio frequency settings. "It sounds like they're trying to scramble air support. But the weather's getting worse up north." Dark clouds were indeed building over the mountain peaks, threatening the helicopter support they desperately needed. Sarah was methodically working through the enemy positions, applying the systematic approach she had learned during sniper school at Camp Pendleton. She prioritized targets based on the immediate threat they posed to the SEALs, starting with crew-served weapons and designated marksmen before moving to riflemen in positions that offered effective fire on the Americans below. Her third shot eliminated a rocket-propelled grenade team that had been maneuvering to a position where they could destroy the SEALs' cover with high-explosive rounds. Sarah had spotted them moving through a dried creek bed, using the natural terrain to approach undetected. Her bullet struck the RPG gunner just as he was preparing to fire, causing the weapon to discharge harmlessly into the ground. The psychological effect on the remaining enemy fighters was becoming obvious, even from Sarah's distant position. They were beginning to panic, realizing that someone was systematically eliminating their most effective fighters with precise long-range shots. Several fighters abandoned their positions and began retreating toward predetermined escape routes. But Sarah knew this battle wasn't over. The enemy commander was still coordinating the ambush, and she could see through her scope that at least 8 fighters remained in effective positions. More importantly, she was running low on ammunition. Her medical supply missions didn't require extensive combat loads, so she had brought only 40 rounds of precision ammunition. She had already fired 6 shots, with 6 confirmed eliminations. At this rate, she could continue supporting the SEALs for maybe 10 more minutes before running out of ammunition. After that, they would be on their own again, and the enemy still had enough fighters to overwhelm the trapped team. Morrison was beginning to formulate a plan based on the support they were receiving from their unknown benefactor. "Park Chen, I want you to work your way toward that rocky outcrop about 50 meters east. When our guardian angel takes his next shot, we move. Santos, you stay here and keep trying to raise air support." Sarah watched through her scope as the SEALs prepared to move to better positions. She could see what Morrison was planning, and it made tactical sense. If she could eliminate 2 more key threats, the Americans would have enough breathing room to establish defensive positions that could hold until reinforcements arrived. Her next target was an enemy team leader who was trying to reorganize his scattered fighters into a coherent defensive line. Sarah had been tracking him for several minutes, waiting for him to expose himself long enough for a clear shot. When he finally stepped into the open to signal to his men, she was ready. The bullet struck him in the center of his chest, and Sarah watched through her scope as the remaining enemy fighters lost their coordination completely. Without effective leadership, they began operating as individuals rather than a cohesive unit, making them far less dangerous to the professional soldiers they were fighting. As the enemy formation collapsed, Morrison seized the opportunity to move his team to better positions. The SEALs bounded from cover to cover with practiced efficiency, using suppressive fire and tactical movement to reach more defensible terrain. Sarah provided overwatch, keeping her scope trained on potential threat areas, but their unknown enemy commander wasn't finished. Through her scope, Sarah could see him rallying his remaining fighters for what appeared to be a final assault on the SEALs' new position. He had about 6 men left, and they were preparing to rush the Americans' position from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah realized this was the critical moment. If the enemy's final assault succeeded, the SEALs would be overrun despite everything she had done to help them. She had 4 rounds left in her magazine, and 1 spare magazine remaining. 8 bullets to eliminate 6 fighters and save 6 American lives. The mathematics were simple, but the execution would require every bit of skill she had developed during her military career and maintained during her years as a humanitarian doctor. Sarah took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and prepared for the most important shots of her life. The enemy commander, a battle-hardened Taliban veteran named Gul Mohammed, was growing desperate as he watched his carefully planned ambush fall apart under the precise fire of an invisible sniper. He had lost 9 of his best fighters to shots that seemed to come from nowhere, and his remaining men were beginning to question whether they were fighting Americans or supernatural forces. Gul Mohammed had been planning this ambush for months, using intelligence provided by a corrupt Afghan official to target a high-value American Special Forces team. The operation was supposed to be a significant victory for his group, proving that they could eliminate elite Western soldiers and boost recruitment in the region. Instead, he was facing a humiliating defeat that would destroy his reputation and potentially cost him his life when his superiors learned of the failure. Through his binoculars, Gul Mohammed studied the mountainside where he believed the mysterious sniper was positioned. He had been a fighter for over 20 years, surviving Soviet occupation, civil war, and the American invasion by adapting to changing circumstances and learning from his enemies. This sniper was unlike anything he had encountered before. Sarah, Mitchell watched the enemy commander through her scope as he organized his remaining fighters for what she recognized as a desperate final assault. She had seen similar situations during her military service in Iraq, where cornered insurgents would launch suicide attacks rather than accept defeat. These final stands were always the most dangerous, as desperate men fought with nothing left to lose. The enemy fighters were positioning themselves in a semicircle around the SEALs' defensive position, preparing to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah counted 6 men armed with assault rifles and at least 2 grenades. If they reached the Americans' position, the close-quarters battle would heavily favor the attackers due to their numerical advantage. Morrison could sense the coming storm as he watched enemy movement through his own scope. "They're setting up for a final push," he warned his team over their tactical radio network. "Everyone check your ammunition and prepare for close contact." The SEALs quickly inventoried their remaining supplies and found the numbers weren't encouraging. Santos had managed to establish intermittent radio contact with their base, but weather conditions were preventing helicopter support for at least another 30 minutes. "Base is saying they have birds in the air, but they can't navigate through the storm system moving in from the north," she reported grimly. "We're on our own until the weather clears." Sarah made rapid calculations as she prepared for the most challenging shooting sequence of her career. 6 targets, 8 remaining bullets, unknown amount of time before they began their assault. She would need to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, requiring her to work the bolt action of her rifle faster than she had ever done in training or combat. The first enemy fighter began moving toward the SEAL's position, using a series of boulders for cover as he advanced. Sarah tracked him through her scope, waiting for the optimal moment when he would be exposed long enough for a guaranteed hit. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition on uncertain shots. When the fighter paused behind a rock to check his weapon, Sarah fired. The bullet struck him center mass and he collapsed immediately, but her muzzle flash had revealed her position to the remaining enemy fighters, who immediately began directing fire toward her location while continuing their advance. Sarah rolled to a new position behind a different boulder as bullets began striking the rocks around her previous location. She had maybe 10 seconds before they adjusted their fire and found her new position. Working the bolt action with practiced speed, she chambered another round and acquired her second target. The next enemy fighter was advancing along a dried creek bed, using the natural depression for concealment. But Sarah had studied the terrain for hours and knew exactly where he would emerge. When his head appeared above the creek bank, she was waiting. Her second shot eliminated another threat. Morrison watched in amazement as the mysterious sniper continued eliminating enemy fighters with impossible accuracy while under fire. "Whoever that is up there has serious training," he commented to Park, who was providing medical aid to Chen's wounded shoulder. "Those are professional-level shots under combat conditions." Gul Mohammed realized his assault was failing before it properly began. 2 more of his men had fallen to the invisible sniper, and the remaining 4 were hesitating, afraid to advance into the killing zone. He made the desperate decision to lead the charge himself, hoping his personal example would inspire his men to follow. Sarah saw the enemy commander break cover and begin sprinting toward the SEAL's position, screaming commands in Pashto to rally his remaining fighters. This was the moment that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. If she could eliminate the leader, the remaining fighters would likely retreat or surrender. But Gul Mohammed was moving erratically, changing direction every few steps to avoid sniper fire. Sarah had to lead her target significantly, accounting for his unpredictable movement pattern. She fired, but the bullet struck the ground just inches from his feet as he suddenly changed direction. Sarah cursed under her breath as she worked the bolt action. She had 5 bullets remaining and 4 enemy fighters still advancing on the SEAL's position. The enemy commander was now within 100 meters of Morrison's team, close enough to throw grenades with deadly accuracy. The next few seconds would determine whether 6 American Special Forces operators lived or died in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. Sarah steadied her rifle, controlled her breathing, and prepared to fire the most important shots of her life. Everything she had learned during her military training, everything she had experienced during her humanitarian work, had prepared her for this moment. Morrison could see the enemy commander approaching their position and knew they had only moments before the situation became desperate. "Get ready for close contact," he shouted to his team as they prepared for what might be their final fight. But high in the mountains above, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was already lining up her next shot, determined that these American soldiers would return home to their families. Her medical oath required her to save lives, and today she would save them with the skills she had learned as a Marine Corps sniper. Sarah's next shot caught Gul Mohammed in mid-stride as he charged toward the SEAL's position. The enemy commander stumbled and fell, his assault rifle spinning away across the rocky ground. The psychological impact on his remaining fighters was immediate and decisive. Without their leader, the surviving men lost their resolve and began retreating toward predetermined escape routes. Sarah quickly engaged 2 more fighters as they attempted to flee, eliminating them with precision shots that demonstrated her complete mastery of long-range marksmanship. The remaining enemy fighters disappeared into the mountainous terrain, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape the invisible sniper who had systematically destroyed their ambush. Morrison watched in stunned silence as the battlefield fell quiet for the first time in over an hour. The sudden absence of gunfire was almost surreal after the intensity of the firefight. "Is it over?" Chen asked, wincing as Park continued treating his shoulder wound. "Did we actually survive that?" "Looks like it," Morrison replied, but he remained cautious. "Santos, can you get a clear count on enemy casualties? And keep trying to raise air support. I want confirmation that we're secure before we move from this position." Years of combat experience had taught him never to assume a battle was truly finished. Through her scope, Sarah conducted a systematic scan of the entire battle area to ensure no enemy fighters remained in positions where they could threaten the SEALs. She counted 11 confirmed eliminations, with the remaining fighters having fled beyond her effective engagement range. The Americans were safe, at least for the moment, but Sarah knew her situation was becoming increasingly precarious. She had revealed her position through muzzle flashes and had been under enemy fire for several minutes. More importantly, she could hear helicopter rotors approaching from the north, indicating that American reinforcements were finally arriving despite the weather conditions. Sarah began the rapid process of disassembling her rifle and packing her equipment. She had learned during her humanitarian work that the best way to avoid complicated questions was to disappear before anyone had a chance to ask them. Her presence in this region was semi-official at best, and she had no desire to spend months explaining her actions to military investigators. The first helicopter, a UH-60 Black Hawk, appeared over the ridgeline within minutes of the firefight's conclusion. Morrison popped green smoke to mark their position and began preparing his team for extraction. "Everyone stay alert until we're wheels up," he ordered. "We still don't know who our mystery sniper is or if there are any more enemy forces in the area." As the helicopter settled into a landing zone about 50 meters from the SEAL's position, Morrison made a crucial decision. "Santos, Chen, get on that bird with Park. I want our wounded treated immediately." He turned to the remaining team members. "Kowalski and I are going to try to locate our guardian angel and get some answers." Sarah had anticipated this possibility and was already moving toward a predetermined extraction point where she had cached additional medical supplies 3 days earlier. Her years of operating in hostile territory had taught her to always have multiple escape routes and contingency plans. She moved through the mountainous terrain with the confidence of someone who understood both the landscape and the local population. Morrison and Petty Officer First Class Mike Kowalski began climbing toward the area where they believed the sniper shots had originated. The terrain was steep and treacherous, made more difficult by their combat equipment and the thin air at high altitude. But both men were determined to identify the person who had saved their lives. "Boss, look at this," Kowalski called out when they reached Sarah's primary shooting position. He was examining the area behind a large boulder where brass casings glinted in the afternoon sunlight. "These are .308 match-grade rounds, and whoever was shooting knows how to maintain a clean position. This is professional-level fieldcraft." Morrison studied the shooting position with the analytical eye of someone trained in reconnaissance and surveillance. The sniper had chosen an excellent location with clear lines of sight to the entire battle area, multiple escape routes, and natural camouflage. More importantly, the precise spacing of the brass casings indicated someone with formal military training in long-range precision shooting. "Whoever this was, they saved our lives," Morrison said quietly, collecting several brass casings as evidence. 11 confirmed kills at ranges between 400 and 800 meters, all while under enemy fire. "That's some of the finest shooting I've ever seen outside of a Marine Corps scout sniper." By the time the two SEALs reached the shooting position, Sarah was already more than a kilometer away, moving through terrain that would be nearly impossible to track. She had spent years learning to navigate mountain environments during her humanitarian missions, and she used every bit of that knowledge to disappear into the landscape. Sarah paused at her supply cache to retrieve additional medical equipment and civilian clothes that would allow her to blend in with local populations. Within 30 minutes of the battle's conclusion, she had transformed from a precision marksman back into Dr. Sarah Mitchell, humanitarian aid worker traveling through the region to establish medical clinics for remote villages. Morrison spent another hour searching the area with Kowalski and additional personnel from the extraction team, but they found no trace of the mysterious sniper beyond the brass casings and evidence of the shooting position. "It's like they just vanished into thin air," Kowalski observed as they prepared to return to the helicopter. The helicopter crew had been monitoring radio frequencies and reported no unusual communications in the area. Local villagers questioned later claimed to have heard the gunfight, but saw no strangers in the region. The Afghan interpreter Hassan suggested that perhaps they had been helped by a ghost warrior, sent by God to protect righteous fighters. As the helicopters departed with the SEAL team, Sarah was already approaching a small village 15 kilometers away, where she was expected to establish a temporary medical clinic. The villagers welcomed her warmly, having heard about her work from other communities. None of them would ever suspect that the gentle doctor treating their children had just eliminated 11 enemy fighters in one of the most precise displays of marksmanship ever witnessed in the Afghan conflict. Morrison filed his after-action report that evening, documenting the ambush, the casualties, and the mysterious sniper who had saved his team. Military intelligence officers would spend weeks investigating the incident, interviewing local sources and analyzing the evidence, but they would never identify the person who had intervened so decisively in the battle. The brass casings collected from the shooting position were analyzed by forensic experts, but the ammunition was commercially available and provided no useful leads. The ballistic evidence confirmed the exceptional marksmanship skills of whoever had fired the shots, but offered no clues about their identity or affiliation. Sarah Mitchell continued her humanitarian work in the region for another 2 weeks before rotating back to the United States for medical supplies and administrative meetings. She never spoke about the incident to anyone, considering it simply another day when her unique combination of medical training and military experience had allowed her to save lives in a dangerous world. 3 months after the incident, Lieutenant Commander Morrison found himself sitting in a classified briefing room at Joint Special Operations Command headquarters in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The investigation into their mysterious benefactor had expanded far beyond what he had initially expected, drawing the attention of multiple intelligence agencies and senior military officials. Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the briefing officer, spread photographs and documents across the conference table as she addressed Morrison and the other team members. "Gentlemen, what happened to your team in Afghanistan has generated significant interest at the highest levels of government. We've never encountered a situation where an unidentified civilian intervened so effectively in a military operation. The investigation had been thorough and frustrating in equal measure. Military intelligence had interviewed hundreds of local civilians, analyzed satellite imagery, and cross-referenced the timing of the incident with known military and intelligence operations in the region. Every lead had ended in dead ends and more questions. The ballistic analysis confirms what you reported," Colonel Hayes continued, pointing to enlarged photographs of the brass casings. 11 shots fired, 11 confirmed kills at ranges between 400 and 750 meters. The precision and timing of these shots indicate someone with advanced military training, possibly Marine Corps Scout Sniper or Army Special Forces Sniper School. Santos raised her hand during the briefing. "Ma'am, have we considered the possibility that this was a friendly forces operation we weren't briefed on? Maybe some kind of classified surveillance or counterintelligence mission?" It was a logical question that had occurred to everyone involved in the investigation. Colonel Hayes shook her head grimly. "We've checked with every agency, every special operations unit, and every intelligence organization with assets in that region. No one had personnel in position to provide the support you received. Officially, your guardian angel doesn't exist." The room fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. Morrison exchanged glances with his team members, all of whom had been hoping for a simple explanation that would solve the mystery. Instead, they were confronting the possibility that someone with extraordinary skills had been operating independently in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. "What about foreign nationals?" Shen asked, his wounded shoulder now fully healed but still tender in cold weather. "Could this have been a contractor or maybe someone from another coalition partner?" The question reflected the team's growing desperation to understand what had happened to them. "We've explored every possibility," Colonel Hayes replied, consulting her notes. "The British SAS, Australian SASR, Canadian JTF-2 and other coalition special forces have all confirmed they had no assets in that area. Private military contractors operating in Afghanistan have been questioned, and none report having personnel with the necessary skills in that region during the relevant time frame." Park leaned forward in his chair, studying the ballistic evidence photographs. "Ma'am, those shots were made under combat conditions while taking enemy fire. We're not talking about someone who learned to shoot on weekends. Whoever saved us has serious military training and combat experience." The investigation had revealed other puzzling details that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Satellite imagery from the day of the incident showed no vehicles approaching or leaving the area where the sniper had been positioned. Local villagers insisted they had seen no strangers in the region, and Afghan security forces reported no unusual activity. Morrison had been wrestling with the incident for months, trying to reconcile his rational understanding of military operations with the inexplicable nature of their rescue. "Colonel, I've been thinking about this constantly since it happened. Someone with that level of skill doesn't just appear and disappear without leaving traces. There has to be something we're missing." What Morrison and his team didn't know was that 2,000 miles away, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was conducting a medical clinic in a refugee camp in Jordan, treating Syrian families who had fled the ongoing civil war. She had returned to the United States briefly after her Afghanistan mission, restocked her medical supplies, and deployed to a new humanitarian crisis without ever speaking about the incident that had saved 6 American lives. Sarah's supervisor at Doctors Without Borders had noticed her unusual equipment request during her supply restocking. "Sarah, Why do you need such extensive survival gear and communication equipment for medical missions? Dr. Elizabeth Warren had asked during their meeting in New York. The regions where I work are often remote and dangerous, Sarah had replied honestly. Being prepared for any situation helps me provide better medical care and keeps me alive to help more people. It wasn't technically a lie, though it certainly wasn't the complete truth about her capabilities and activities. Back at Fort Bragg, Colonel Hayes was presenting the investigation's most frustrating conclusion.
Gentlemen, we've exhausted every conventional avenue of investigation.
The person who saved your lives has managed to remain completely invisible to our intelligence apparatus. This suggests either exceptional operational, security training or inside knowledge of how our systems work. The possibility that their mysterious benefactor might be a former American military member had been considered extensively. The investigation team had cross-referenced the ballistic evidence with known capabilities of former Marine Corps and Army snipers, but the database contained thousands of potential candidates, and most had solid alibis for the time period in question. What's our next step? Morrison asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't satisfy his need for closure. The incident had fundamentally changed his perspective on military operations and the assumption that they always knew who was operating in their areas of responsibility. Colonel Hayes closed her briefing folder with finality. The investigation remains technically open, but we've reached the limits of what conventional intelligence gathering can achieve. Unless new evidence emerges or someone comes forward voluntarily, we may never identify your guardian angel. As the briefing concluded and the team members prepared to return to their units, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that their mysterious savior was still out there somewhere, continuing whatever mission had brought them to that remote mountainside at exactly the right moment. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Meanwhile, in Jordan, Sarah Mitchell was teaching a group of Syrian refugee children how to properly clean and bandage minor wounds. The children laughed as she demonstrated techniques on a stuffed animal, their joy temporarily overcoming the trauma of war and displacement. None of them could imagine that their gentle teacher had once been one of the deadliest snipers in the United States Marine Corps. That evening, as Sarah reviewed patient files in her tent, she briefly considered the SEAL team she had helped in Afghanistan. She wondered if they had survived their deployment and returned safely to their families, but she quickly pushed such thoughts aside, focusing instead on the medical challenges facing the refugee population under her care. The mystery of the unidentified marksman would become legend within special operations communities, passed down through informal networks as an example of the unexpected guardian angels, who sometimes appeared in the most desperate moments. But the true identity of the person who had saved 6 American lives would remain hidden, protected by the very skills and discretion that had made the rescue possible. Years later, when Morrison had retired from the Navy and was working as a defense contractor, he would still occasionally search online databases and military records, hoping to find some clue about the person who had intervened so decisively in his team's darkest hour. But Dr. Sarah Mitchell had returned to her humanitarian work, carrying her secret with the same quiet professionalism that had made her both an exceptional Marine and an extraordinary healer. The official files would remain classified indefinitely, though they contained no useful information beyond confirming that someone with remarkable skills had chosen to save American lives at considerable personal risk. The mystery endured, a reminder that even in the most monitored and surveilled conflicts in human history, individual acts of courage could still occur beyond the reach of official recognition or understanding.